She had been cut in half at the waist with the skin peeled off her chest, and I quote, in a fashion like a sweater so that it was attached at the shoulders. Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you are well. My name is Gabby and today we're going to be talking about Tony Costa, otherwise known as the Cape Cod Vampire. In 1966, Liza Rodman was 7 years old and had temporarily moved with her mother Betty and younger sister Louise from their West Bridgewater, Massachusetts home to a room in the Royal Coachman Motel in Provincetown, where Betty had got a summer job as the director of housekeeping. As Betty worked full-time and liked to spend her spare time going out drinking and dancing, the girls had a lot of different babysitters that their mother wasn't exactly particular about. At least one was abusive, another was the Royal Coachman's young hippie handyman, Tony Costa, who quickly became Liza's favourite. Tony never yelled or treated them as an inconvenience. He'd take them for long drives in his truck while singing along with Jefferson Airplane, buy them ice cream, push them on the swings and ask them questions about their lives. Many years later, Liza would describe him as being one of the few adults in her life who treated her with kindness. Although Betty only worked at the Royal Coachman for 1 year, the family continued to spend summers in Provincetown, and Tony continued to mind the girls when the mother was busy. Until 1969, when the family went for their usual holiday in Provincetown and Tony wasn't there. Liza wondered where he'd gone, but being 10, she didn't give the matter much thought. Then, many years later, in 2005, a nightmare featuring Tony prompted her to ask her mother if she knew what had happened to her beloved babysitter. Her mother calmly and matter-of-factly responded, "Well, I remember he turned out to be a serial killer." Anton Charles Costa, better known as Tony, was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts on the 2nd of August 1944. The first sign of what was to come occurred in November 1961, when at the age of 17 he broke into a neighbour's apartment. When the 14-year-old girl living there woke up to see him looming over her, she screamed and he fled. However, 3 days later he returned and tried to drag her down the building stairs, being thwarted when the other neighbours came to the girl's rescue. Costa was convicted of burglary and assault, receiving a 1-year suspended sentence and 3 years probation. The following year, Tony got married to a teenage girl and subsequently fathered 3 children. But by 1966, he was heavily using a variety of drugs, resulting in bizarre, irresponsible and allegedly violent behaviour that put a great deal of strain on the marriage, leading to the couple's separation. That year, the same one that he'd met 7-year-old Liza, Tony decided to drive to California. En route, he picked up 2 young girls, Bonnie Williams and Diane Fedoroff, who wanted to hitch a ride to Pennsylvania. Neither were ever seen again. When questioned by police, Tony claimed that he dropped them off in Hayward, California, and hadn't seen them since. He returned to Massachusetts 10 days later. By 1967, he'd moved on from using drugs to dealing them, including amphetamines, LSD, and barbiturates. The same year, he non-fatally shot a female acquaintance in the woods near Truro, which he claimed was an accident and apologised for. In late January 1968, Tony went back to California, briefly settling in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco and acquiring a new girlfriend, Barbara Spalding, who later vanished the day that Tony left the city to go back home to Massachusetts. On the 17th of May, he burgled the office of a doctor he'd been getting many of his drugs from before being dropped as a patient, stealing surgical instruments and drugs valued at $5,000. A week later, 18-year-old Sydney Monson disappeared from Provincetown after being seen getting into a car with Tony. By August 1968, Tony Costa's wife Avis had filed for divorce and Tony got a new live-in lover, teenager Susan Perry, who he called his kid chick. On the 10th of September, she too vanished, with Tony telling anyone who asked that she'd gone to Mexico. As America in the 1960s had no shortage of teenage runaways who'd been swept up in the hippie counterculture and associated drugs, it was quite a believable story. In mid-September, Tony was arrested for driving on a suspended license. He was arrested again on the 25th for failing to pay child support and stayed in jail until the 8th of November. Soon after his release, he met Christine Gallant, a fellow member of the 1960s hippie drug scene. Later that month, Christine was found dead in her New York apartment, having seemingly drowned in her bathtub after overdosing on barbiturates. On the 24th of January 1969, two more young women, Patricia Walsh and Mary Ann Wysocki, arrived in Provincetown for a weekend vacation on Cape Cod, having driven from Rhode Island in Patricia's VW Beetle. Upon them checking into a guest house, the landlady introduced the two 23-year-olds to another guest, Tony Costa. The following morning, the landlady found a note pinned to the door of the girls' room reading, "Could you possibly give me a ride to Truro early in the morning? Signed, Tony." That afternoon, someone saw Tony with two women in a VW driving toward Truro. It was the last time that anyone other than Tony Costa saw Patricia and Mary Ann alive. The following day, the guest house's landlady found another note on the bedroom door, this time reading, "We are checking out. Thank you for your many kindnesses," and signed Mary Ann and Pat. It should be noted that while Mary Ann's name was spelt with an E, on the note it was spelt without it. Patricia and Mary Ann weren't like previous missing women in a couple of key respects. They had lives, responsibilities, and plans that meant they wouldn't just take off somewhere without telling anyone and not go home. Patricia was a second-grade teacher, and Mary Ann being in the process of finishing her degree at Rhode Island College. So when they failed to return home from their weekend away, their families quickly contacted the police, who launched an investigation. On the 2nd of February, Patricia's VW was spotted parked in a woodland area near Pine Grove Cemetery in Truro, although Tony took the car away later that day, first to Boston, then to Burlington, Vermont. The sighting gave the police some idea as to where to focus their search. On the 8th of February, one of the police officers involved in the search noticed an indentation in the ground. Digging in that spot soon revealed a bag containing the dismembered remains of a woman who wasn't Mary Ann or Patricia. She was later identified as Susan Perry. Meanwhile, Tony had been found by the police still in possession of Patricia's car. When questioned about it, he produced a dubious bill of sale and claimed that he bought the car off Patricia before she and Mary had left for Canada. When further interviewed regarding Patricia and Mary Ann's disappearance, Tony kept giving inconsistent answers. On the 3rd of March, a telegram for Tony arrived at his mother's house in Provincetown, reading, "What happened? We waited as planned. Is everything all right? We'll meet you as scheduled. New York City. Love, Pat and Mary Ann." Again, Mary Ann's name was spelt incorrectly. The telegram was later found to have originated from a New York City telephone number that Tony had access to. On the 5th of March, the continued search of Truro Woods, where Tony grew a large amount of marijuana, resulted in the discovery of the separately buried head and torso of Mary Ann. Soon after, Patricia's body was unearthed from another grave nearby. She had been cut in half at the waist, with the skin peeled off her chest, and I quote, "in a fashion like a sweater so that it was attached at the shoulders." Underneath Patricia's body were the dismembered remains of Sidney Monson. Tony Costa was arrested on the 5th of March. In custody, he continued to keep changing his story, twice implicating friends of his, sometimes blaming made-up alter egos, and failing several polygraphs. A psych exam on the 31st of March resulted in a diagnosis of schizoid personality. A second one 3 months later led to the psychiatrist describing Tony Costa as a sexually dangerous man who was capable of murder. The trial began on the 6th of May, 1970. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, Tony maintained his innocence throughout it. The jury, however, had other ideas and found him guilty. On the 29th of May 1970, Tony Costa was sentenced to life in prison. He was remanded to the Walpole Correctional Institution. Once in prison, Tony stocked his cell with books on ritual magic and the occult, including a copy of the Satanic Bible. He also wrote an unpublished novel, Resurrection, in which he depicts a version of the murders. In the novel, he claims that a friend of his, referred to as Corey, shot Patricia and Mary Ann while high on LSD and Quaaludes, and then after subduing Corey, he killed Mary Ann with a knife to end her suffering. The deaths of Susan and Sydney are depicted as drug overdoses, with their dismemberment being blamed on Tony's supposed alter ego, Carl, and Tony claiming that he had no knowledge of the events until after their deaths. On the 12th of May 1974, Tony Costa was found hanging from the upper bars of his cell, a leather belt around his neck. His death was ruled a suicide, but there are those who believe that the other inmates may have killed him. After finding out about Tony's crimes, Liza Rodman spent a great deal of time and effort digging into the story in order to get to grips with the revelation that the friendly young man she remembered was the unrepentant killer of multiple women. Later writing a book about it entitled The Babysitter, My Summers with a Serial Killer. Despite that, it is still something that she struggles with, particularly after several people involved in the case told her that she was lucky that she had been so young when she knew Tony Costa, or she might have ended up as one of his victims. She is also aware of the likely possibility that his behaviour towards her was because he was grooming her to be one of his kid chicks when she was older, and perhaps even yet another victim. That was the case of Tony Costa, aka the Cape Cod Vampire. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing if you like true crime. It would be greatly appreciated. I'll be releasing new videos on Mondays and Fridays, but until I see you again, please be safe, be well, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.